Well, ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be looking at the final college football playoff scenarios with the conference championship games happening tonight and tomorrow, and then the final rankings reveal on Sunday. This is the last scenario video to take a look at the different options for all these teams on where they're going to be seated. There is some agreement on certain teams. Obviously, we can't completely predict what's going to happen tonight and tomorrow, so that, leaves some variance, but college football playoff bracket scenarios, 5 possible outcomes this weekend. Scenario one, no upsets. I don't know what happened there. Scenario one, no upsets, no debates. So in this scenario, you've got Oregon winning, you've got Texas winning, so they would be the clear 1-2 obvious. If SMU beats Clemson, they're very slight favorites. They're around 2.5 point favorites. They would be the 3 seed. Boise State winning against UNLV as 4 point favorites. That game's happening tonight. They would be the 4 seed. The 5 seed Notre Dame would move up. So I guess that would be the real difference when you look at Notre Dame and Penn State. Penn State loses to Oregon. Notre Dame, with the one loss, they'd move in front of Penn State. Some people say that shouldn't be a thing. In this scenario, though, if you are Penn State, Arizona State is a more favorable matchup than Alabama. So maybe that's what the committee ends up doing. They say, look, Bama has the 3 losses. We don't really want to penalize Penn State for being in a conference because honestly, that's what would be happening here because Notre Dame not being in a conference, they're not going to get another loss, and they end up moving up to the 5 seed, but they still have to face Alabama, which would be a tougher matchup, we would say, than in Arizona State. Arizona State wins, they're possibly going to be the 11th. It's interesting they put Arizona State at the 11 and not the 12. I would imagine that'd be another quality win over Iowa State. So Arizona State, right now, they're ranked like 15th. They jump up in front of Alabama because Arizona State would have 2 losses. Bama has 3 losses, but Arizona State is a conference champion. Bama didn't even play in it, and Bama does have bad losses as well. Ohio State, Tennessee looks extremely likely because the only other matchup I could see for Ohio State would, there's some rumblings about maybe Ohio State, Bama. In like a 7v10 game, it would be. I mean, I don't see Ohio State moving up to the 6 seed because there's going to be an argument about Penn State. And honestly, I've seen like 50-50 opinions on Penn State and Ohio State. Some people say that if Ohio State and Penn State have 2 losses, Ohio State should be in over Penn State because Ohio State beat Penn State on the road by 7. But then the other argument is Penn State finishes the regular season with 1 loss. Ohio State finishes the regular season with 2 losses. Do you penalize Penn State for being in the Big Ten championship? But also, Ohio State has a much better resume than Penn State. If Penn State loses by 14 or more to Oregon, I do think there's going to be a lot of argument that's going to say Ohio State should be in front of Penn State and possibly. But I mean, what do you do with Georgia in that scenario? If Georgia has 3 losses, where do they slot in? Because in this, you've got 3 loss Georgia in front of Ohio State. You're not really punishing Georgia for losing the SEC championship game to a Texas team they've already beaten. So there's a lot. I do think the most likely scenario here, and this is a very likely scenario if you look at the betting odds, like Ohio State is significant heavy favorites to be the number 8 seed. It's going to be Ohio State versus Tennessee. The only other matchup I've seen predicted is like Ohio State, Alabama, or Ohio State versus Indiana, which they're not going to do Ohio State, Indiana again. They're going to avoid that. This is a very likely scenario. Georgia, Indiana, Arizona State, Penn State, Ohio State hosting Tennessee, Notre Dame hosting Bama. I think that's probably the most likely scenario at this point. Scenario 2, UNLV knocks off Boise State. So what happens if just UNLV wins? You can see Arizona State jumps up to the 4 seed. This would be Arizona State winning against Iowa State. They jump up to the 4 seed because Boise State's not there to block them anymore. UNLV default goes to the number 12 seed. They would face Notre Dame. That would be very nice for Notre Dame. Boy, maybe if you're Notre Dame, you should be rooting for that because then you would possibly avoid Bama. But then Penn State would get Bama there, and you still do have Indiana versus Georgia, which seems very, very likely at this point if Georgia loses to Texas, and then Ohio State, Tennessee. Neither of those teams are playing. That seems very likely as well, like those two teams are going to face each other. Clemson beats SMU in this scenario. So you can see Boise State moves up to the 3 seed, Arizona State moves up to the 4 seed. Clemson is the default 12 seed. They would face Notre Dame on the road. Ohio State still faces Tennessee. Indiana still faces Georgia. Bama still faces Penn State on the road in that potential scenario. Scenario 4, wins by Penn State and by Georgia. In this scenario, Ohio State still faces Tennessee. But because Georgia wins, you see Georgia at the 2. Penn State moves to the 1 because Texas also loses. it changes things a little bit. You've got Indiana taking on Notre Dame, an in-state rivalry there. That would be kind of a cool matchup. And then you do have Arizona State taking on Texas, with Alabama getting booted out of the rankings, even with SMU winning in that scenario. Wow. Oh, no. Bama's the 12 seed. My bad. Wow. Bama facing Oregon. Man, that would not be good if you're Oregon. I mean, I'm not saying Alabama's a world beater, but they're a team that can beat anyone. That would be a real bad thing for Oregon, because you're the 5 seed. You think, all right, it's still decent. You know, I think they're going to put Arizona State at the 12. Although, you know, you've got Texas there at the 6. Texas versus Arizona State. The only matchup we're seeing continuous is Ohio State, Tennessee. It seems like that's pretty locked in. I also think Indiana, Georgia is pretty much locked in, dependent on Georgia losing. Obviously, in this scenario, Georgia wins. Scenario 5, higher ranked seeds go down. Yeah, this is not all going to happen. Penn State as the 1, Georgia as the 2, Clemson as the 3, UNLV as the 4. Wait, how is UNLV over Arizona State? What? But then you still have Ohio State. Yeah, so I think Ohio State's definitely going to face Tennessee. My guess is, okay, this is what my guess is. If you go back to the first one, you know, that's the one with 0 upsets. This is probably most likely. If this is I could predict the times on these games. This Ohio State Tennessee is probably going to be the Friday night game, if I had to guess. So this is the thing. There's one Friday night game on ABC. There's 3 Saturday games. There's a noon, there's a 4, and then there's an 8. This is going to be the sole Friday game on ABC. Ohio State hosting Tennessee at 8 o'clock. Notre Dame, Alabama in South Bend is going to be 8 o'clock on Saturday night. Indiana, Georgia is going to be 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Athens. And then Penn State, Arizona State would be noon. That'd be the noon window game, I would imagine. Over the way, 5v12, it doesn't matter. It's Notre Dame, Bama. They're going to put that on at prime time. Arizona State, Penn State would be the noon game. Indiana, Georgia would be the 4 o'clock game. Ohio State, Indiana would be the Friday night game. Notre Dame, Alabama would be the Saturday night game. And then and then you also have other scenarios where, well, what happens to Miami? People are going to clamor for Miami to be in over Alabama, although the committee basically took out all of the drama when they said the teams that have already played are seated where they're at, meaning that because Alabama and Miami don't have games left, Miami cannot jump Alabama, and also Ole Miss or South Carolina cannot jump Alabama. So that's why it's like it comes down to Alabama. But what about Clemson beating yeah, if Clemson beats SMU, they just knock SMU out and they keep Alabama in? Yeah, that's what they do. Wow. And honestly, I've told people I probably see that happening because of the analytics and the strength of record, but there would be some serious outrage if this happened, because SMU would have 2 losses. One of their losses would be an extra game that Alabama doesn't have to play, which is the conference championship game. The problem for SMU is if Clemson was like a top 5 team and they lost to them, I think SMU would still be in, but Clemson is like analytically a borderline top 20 team, so it's not a great loss if you lose to Clemson. That would be the problem with that. But yeah, I mean, we'll have to see what happens with this. I think, scenario 1 is most likely just because it's all the favorites winning. What is this scenario? UNLV. I mean, UNLV could win. Boise State, to me, is one-dimensional, and they struggle to run the ball in the red zone. At least they have recently. And UNLV is going to load up the box. But UNLV is playing on the road. That's not a neutral site game. That's the problem. But yeah, so that's basically it. And it looks like Ohio State and Tennessee are basically locked into face each other unless something happens to where Oregon just destroys Penn State by such a margin to where they have to move Penn State below Ohio State. Georgia, a 3-loss team, I do think will probably be in front of Ohio State because they're not, unless Georgia gets just crushed as well, then you could argue it. But yeah, these look like the most likely matchups. Notre Dame, Bama, Ohio State, Tennessee. Ohio State, Tennessee winner faces Oregon. Notre Dame, Bama winner faces Boise State. That's a wide open area. That's a wide open area of the bracket. Here's another wide open area for Penn State. Yeah, so this is what it's looking like. If Penn State draws that 6th seed, you're going to get an SMU team on a neutral site, possibly, if SMU wins. Georgia's going to have to face Texas again. See, I wonder if they'll try and split Georgia and Texas up. I just don't know how they do it. Would they move Georgia? Well, the thing is, if they move Georgia down, the only thing I could see is Move Georgia to 8, move Indiana to 9, move Ohio State to 7, move Tennessee to 10. Then Ohio State are in a 7v10 game. Winner faces Texas. Georgia, Indiana, winner faces Oregon. You would expect Georgia to face Oregon. Yeah, I mean, they could do something like that. But I mean, I don't know if they're really focused on the quarterfinal matchups being conference versus conference. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link that's always in the description.